All right, hello. Welcome to our Athletics Canada coaching webinar. We are here tonight for a super exciting and interesting um, topic. So before we get going, I'm just going to do the usual sort of logistical things. So I'm John LaFranco, Manager of Development Education for Coaches and Officials at Athletics Canada. Um, Everyone's muted. You're kind of behind that webinar screen. If you do have questions, there is a question and answer box. So you can just fire questions in there whenever you want, and I will make sure that they get to our presenters here. Um, there's going to be a kind of a straight presentation, and then we'll have some question period at the end. Vous pouvez aussi demander vos questions en français et je vais traduire. Royden and Brad uh, not fluently bilingual, so I'll uh I'll share. Brad probably more than Royden, but anyway. But that's okay. And the webinar is being recorded. We'll post in the coming days on YouTube. And coaches who've entered their NCCP number and are NCCP certified will receive one PD point for their participation in the webinar tonight. One other special thing about this webinar is that we will actually be a little more interactive than usual. So there are gonna be some questions popping up on the screen for you that we want you to answer. So when that happens, please put your answers in that question and answer box, and so that we can kind of use them as part of the discussion. So just to kind of introduce this topic of self-regulated sports practice. I was at a conference for Nordic Canada, cross-country skiing in Ottawa, and these two fine gentlemen had been invited there to present to that sport this topic. And um, I was blown away, really. Like I was like, wow, this is a fantastic topic. It just kind of when you'll see it's like intuitive, it makes sense, but it's not something that we really like do overtly sometime. Anyway, I'll let them get into the specifics of it, but I wanted to share it with the athletics community, so we invited them on here. So just a quick intro for Brad and Royden. So Brad Young is a full professor at the School of Human Kinetics at University of Ottawa, and his research focuses on the psychology of practice as it relates to talent development and optimal skill acquisition. And you'll see how that applies here. He investigates effective coaching practices and non-linear pedagogies in sport coaching with the aim of more fully engaging young athletes in their own practice. And Royden Radowits is a PhD candidate studying sports psychology at Ottawa with a master's of coaching from University of Alberta. During his undergrad, he competed in track and field and cross country at the University of Alberta, so you may recognize the name from there. He's been growing his mustache pretty much since undergrad, I think. Um, and his dissertation research focuses on the psychology of practice, exploring how emotions and practice conditions enhance athlete learning, performance, and development. So that's it. Take it away, guys. Really excited to have you here. Looking forward to hearing all about self-regulated sports practice.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Let me just oh, sharing screen. Hold on. Let me try and get this going again.
That was good. Whatever you did was good.
Oh, that was working?
Yep.
All right, hold on. Now I've seemed to have messed it up. Give me a second. All right. Let me try that again. All right. So thanks again, John, for that introduction. As you say, my name is Royden. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa. And so Brad and I are really excited to talk to you tonight about this concept of self-regulated sport practice, and specifically on the ideas about how we can maybe get our athletes to have greater ownership over their training, improve the quality of their practice, and contribute overall to greater skill development. So when we're thinking about how athletes can go about optimizing their practice, I see a hand up in the chat.
No, that was me. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's all good. But so when we're thinking about how athletes can optimize their practice, a notable starting point for us to consider is the practice habits of elite athletes. And so beyond this, just this idea that elite athletes are going to train more, what is it about their practices and the way in which they practice that helps to make them more elite and helps them improve the quality of that practice? So when we go to the research, we find that Elite athletes consistently show up on time, ready to go to their practices. They tend to try harder and put in more effort on important tasks. They tend to embrace those challenging, difficult, or even mundane aspects of training. They intentionally choose to work on their weaker or less developed skills. They tend to be a little bit more attentive to key technical details that relate to training tasks. And they're more thoughtful about what they need to do in training and how to do it. So ultimately, what we find is that elite athletes tend to spend more time planning, monitoring, and evaluating their training. And so this last point about this planning, this monitoring and evaluating is what we want to focus on here today, and the psychology behind these elite training habits. So when we start getting into this idea of the psychology of practice, an important concept to bring up is self-regulated learning, which are the processes by which athletes optimize and manage their training. So these are skills that athletes are going to develop and they're going to learn, and ultimately that's going to help them to guide their learning within and between practice sessions. So these psychological processes can be located at different parts of a workout. So for example, prior to practice, if we consider a hurdler, they can plan out what they want to work on for that day and come up with different cues or different ways in which they're going to prime themselves going into that session to work towards those goals. Then during that practice, they can implement different strategies to stay engaged, to stay attentive, but then also just track and monitor how they're working towards their goals for that practice. And then afterwards, that hurdler can reflect on how that practice went, and then make some ideas about what they would want to improve going into the next practice.
And I think it's important to remember when we look at these different phases of self-regulated learning activity, that we would expect that these could be quite active. For example, when you as coaches prescribe workouts to athletes when maybe they do them and you're not there supervising them. But we also don't, I think it's important that we don't underestimate how important these phases of self-regulated thinking are, even when they're doing practices when you're on site. And you might be busy with other athletes and maybe attending to your athletes less than you typically would. So we see these ways of thinking, these phases of thinking as important when you're not there, but also when you're on site and perhaps not attending as intently to the athletes as you would like.
So as I just talked about on the previous slide, when we consider that this could be implicated, or these self-regulated sport practice processes can be implicated within a practice in its entirety, they can also be invoked within a more microscopic perspective of involved in parts of that practice, so in between specific reps and sets. So for example, if we consider a shot putter, right? That shot putter can deliberately plan what they want to cue during a workout, or during their next rep, and what they want to work on within that. So maybe they're thinking about hand position on their next throw. Well, then during that throw, they can check in on how well they implemented it and think about what they're doing during it. And then afterwards, reflect on it to get an idea about what they can continue refining going into that next throw or going into their next set. And then so alongside these metacognitive processes of how they plan, how they check and track what they're doing, and then how they evaluate and reflect, athletes can also regulate certain motivational aspects of as well. So if we consider self-efficacy for challenge here, the one at the top, does that shot putter have the belief in themselves that they can continue throwing well, even if it's raining and the circle's a little wet from the rain? Or do they have the belief that they can continue to recruit appropriate amounts of effort, even if that practice is challenging, or even if it's not going well?
And if we step outside of our academic speak for a minute, what essentially we're looking at here, what's being represented in this slide, are really how athletes think about how they think about their practice, or how athletes think about how they self-motivate during practice. And so the idea here is that if you can attend to some of these verbalizations by your athlete, or have conversations with them around these thoughts and what they're working with, that this information becomes the substrate, so to speak, that you could use to work on supporting them to become more capable and optimal learners in the training environment.
So now that we know a little bit about this idea about self-regulated sport practice, that it involves those key skills of planning, checking, evaluating and reflecting, self-efficacy for challenge, so some of those motivational beliefs around can they recruit appropriate amount of effort. A question that we want to pose to the group here tonight is why might we as coaches value self-regulated sport practice?
So this is where you would all jump in and write questions in the or answers to this question in the question and answer box. So please share your thoughts. They're thinking hard. Oh, here comes one. More time efficient, gets the entire group on track and motivated. Practices would be more efficient. Athlete takes ownership. 2 + 2 for efficient. Haha. That's what I was going to say too. You can kind of get more out of the practice. It creates independence as well in the athletes. Um, it isn't all about do as I say. It shows some motivation and thinking. Athlete accountability. So these are the ideas that are coming in.
Self-accountability, yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Yeah.
better performance in the end too. I mean, if the practice is more efficient, more is going on, then that you know end up with better. Yeah, so here's another athletes better prepared for competition environment. That's another one because in the competition environment, you know, there's less coach involvement sometimes.
Yeah, athletes are going to have to be making decisions for themselves in that environment.
Yeah, cool. All right, good job, group. Thank you for the answers.
So I really like that about like greater athlete accountability and greater ownership over their training. So then when we go into some of the literature behind why self-regulated sport practice is important, one of the things that we see is that elite athletes consistently report greater use of those SRSP or self-regulated sport practice processes. So if we just consider the graph on the bottom, when we're looking at those skills of planning, of checking, and of self-efficacy for challenge, as you move up from the regional level athlete to a provincial to a national to your international level athletes, the athletes at higher skill levels report greater use of these skills in challenging practices. And then even if we look at something like evaluating and reflecting, those international athletes are saying that they reflect on their training more than their provincial level counterparts. And then, you know, your provincial, national, and international level athletes all report giving a high amount of effort into their training. And so not only is this something that's used by those elite athletes, but it's also that engagement in these processes is going to improve learning, so improve their development across sessions. But also if we think about within those practices themselves, their performance during those practices, how they're executing skills is going to be better. And then we also know along with this that engaging multiple of these processes is going to improve learning more than just isolated use. So if we consider an athlete that's just setting a goal for what they want to work on in that practice, but then not thinking about how well it went or checking on how they're doing throughout it, versus an athlete who's coming in with their goal of what they want to work on, they're tracking and monitoring that progress, and then reflecting on how they can continue to refine moving forward, that athlete's going to have a lot more improvement than that other athlete. You know, this is going to be something that helps athletes to be more consistent in their training. So if we consider my background is in endurance running, but if we consider an athlete self-regulating their easy runs between training sessions, if an athlete is able to self-regulate that well and make smart decisions about managing their volume in appropriate ways and not doing too much, leading into that workout, they might have a better experience, they might not be as fatigued, and they might set themselves up for greater success in those sessions that matter. And then we also see that this helps to facilitate more effective coach-athlete dialogue and discussions.
And to this latter point, a lot of the work that we're doing in our research is kind of revisiting some of the coaching models we've long held as being true, and maybe looking at about how they have to change a little bit. And so rather than looking at models that rely strictly on coach direction, we're looking a lot more at collaboration. And so what we call co-regulated coaching models, where you see your work with an athlete as a partnership. And so integral to that means that you're going to work on an interface when you go back and forth with an athlete during their skill acquisition periods, when you're really in the trenches with them on training, where you're going to exchange information with them and interact with them in such a way that they're learning habits from you that you're modeling and that they're shaping, which they can internalize and integrate and take out and work with them in times when they're practicing without your supervision. And so those things that you're modeling and shaping in your close interactions with them become the essentials of developing self-regulated learning skills, self-regulated sport practice processes that they could go and use when they're unsupervised. They can do their own thing there, try out, refine things, and then bring the products of that training back to you in the interface again. And so what that means is, if we consider the value of self-regulated sport practice to the coaching process, self-regulated sport practice can both be an output of effective interactions that you have with your athletes. It then becomes essential for the athletes in their own training when you're not supervising them. And if they're using those skills well, then they have information and products that they can bring back with them when they return to you in that supervised interface. And that enriches everything you do with them. The other point I want to add here, just a quick point, Royden, on the first bullet. We know from 7 or 8 years of research in this area that elite athletes are agreeing that they frequently use these processes more, and it's consistent right across the board. The other thing we know is that they don't use them constantly. So there is some turning on and turning off. But what they do, compared to less elite athletes, is the elite athletes will turn on these processes frequently, especially when they know they need them to enhance their priorities within a skill acquisition setting.
So, now that we've talked a little bit about what is self-regulated sport practice and why it might be important, our next question for us to kind of consider is that while this does largely implicate the athlete themselves, it's how they're regulating their practices. Our question for us today is, as coaches, do we ever consider and do we ever think about how we can develop these learning to learn skills in our athletes? So a really good starting point to this question that we want to pose to the group here tonight is, when you're thinking about your athletes in practice, what does self-regulated sport practice look like, and where can you see them using these skills within it?
All right, so the question box is open. Just wanted to just acknowledge a couple other answers from the previous question because they came in right at the end there. But just say Fraser said it offers better training for active for life participants to compete successfully, and Zahid said it teaches the athlete to be accountable and also teaches mind, not body, just during the session, which I think that's a key one there. The sort of the mind body connection. It's important to kind of mention that. Um, so as people are filling this in, one thing I thought of, like, the part about, do we ever consider this? I think sometimes as a coach, maybe we tend to assume that athletes should be doing this without really telling them. It's like, why wouldn't you be, thinking about this? But I think athletes do need a prompt sometimes to like get to understand the value of it and to make the connection. Like, it has to be deliberate, I think. So that would be my answer to this question, is that even though it sounds like a kind of like non-coach thing, like it's the athlete doing it on their own, the coach's role is really to prompt it and to help them understand what like the value of it. So, and Sam says, in response to the what, like, what does it look like? Where does it happen? At the beginning, at the end, a warm up, and then at the end, a reflection.
Mhm.
So that's good because he's already thinking about the spaces in practice he would like to position this.
Samantha is
Oh, I'm
she.
sorry. I'm sorry.
I said Sam, but Samantha,
She's
yeah.
she's she's thinking about the places in practice where she would like to position this, right?
Yeah.
Here comes another one. It's woven into all aspects of practice, and it starts as soon as practice begins. That's from Zoe.
Yeah, there's lots of little different moments when it might come up, and those athletes might be able to engage some of that thinking around what they want to do and reflecting throughout a practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think coaches might think like, like you do this probably, but just not deliberately thinking about it in this way. Um, so yeah, I think it does happen, sort of, it can happen throughout.
Yeah.
Any other answers out there?
I think, like in any effective coaching, there's planned and there's idiosyncratic or coaching
Mhm.
moments. And I think Royden's going to speak to kind of both those aspects. But I think generally we need to consider both the facets.
Yeah.
For sure.
Um,
Okay, go ahead, Royden. You can move on. I
Yeah.
think.
If more pops up, feel free to interrupt me. But so in our own work of speaking to coaches about where these things can be located or these processes can be located within an athlete's training, one of the places it's athletes organizing and initiating training activities on their own. So again, if we consider a distance runner, they're initiating their easy or long runs on their own without a coach being there, or it's maybe an athlete doing the physio work before practice, or doing their strength work on the side or something like that. It's athletes practicing skills on their own to get a feel for the movements. So one of the parts of my dissertation right now is that I'm going around and watching athletes that are part of different event groups within track and field. And so it's really interesting when you go to a throws practice and you can watch the throwers who aren't in the circle and they're not yet throwing, but they're going to be, the next one up and they're feeling out the movement and priming what they want to do and they're thinking about what they're going to do heading into that next throw. It's athletes teaching and learning from their teammates during practice. So when we were interviewing coaches for some of our work, they talked about how, well, when the coach is teaching one athlete about what the drill is to go, what they're going to be doing next, and that athlete is going first, that they want all their other teammates to be watching and listening to the feedback that that first athlete is getting, so that when that next athlete goes, they're not going to make the same mistakes. It's athletes self-initiating and optimizing that warm-up. So are they starting it on time, and they're keeping to a schedule? And then are they adding in some personalized elements to make sure they're as ready to go as they need to be? Um, it's athletes knowing what they want to work on in a given practice. And then it's athletes prioritizing working on weaknesses during practice. So it's knowing what they need to do to improve. It's athletes self-timing, monitoring, and correcting during practice. So again, apologies for my distance running examples, but if you have a coach that's working with multiple groups at the same time, can that one group that the coach isn't actively working with continue to start their reps in an appropriate time? So if it's 2 minutes rest, are they starting it on the 2 minutes? And then are they adjusting and correcting their pace and their effort as needed throughout that workout? And then it's athletes, analyzing and problem solving during that workout. So can an athlete correct and adjust their techniques throughout a workout without necessarily needing to have that conversation with the coach?
Hey, Royden, I'm just going to jump in because Fraser has an interesting comment here. He says, I think this also happens outside of formal practices and isn't necessarily intentional, so it can be variably helpful or disruptive. And then he says, example, train of thought while driving, brushing teeth, etc. I don't know, Fraser, if you want to kind of add to that, but I think that's interesting. Like, I think it was mentioned about elite athletes being able to turn it on and off. What do you have to say about that sort of like how this works at practice? We've been talking about at practice, but then how outside of practice so that it doesn't sort of become like, all encompassing in a way.
Um, Brad, do you want to?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting comment because we've done actually a lot of work around the psychology of recovery with next gen athletes and athletes at the national training centers. And so the comment there speaks to the idea that athletes that are very turned on to their training don't know how to turn it off. And some of the athletes would talk about kind of being in the vortex and taking home with them at the end of the night. I think what this speaks to now is also using self-regulated sport practice skills to be able to compartmentalize the times around sport and training when you want to actually attend to this. And so, I mean, we talk about time management, but we also talk about maybe compartmentalizing when you're going to deliberately attend to weaknesses and things you want to correct in your approach to sport. And that's something that should transcend the day. So coming up with strategies to kind of locate yourself on that. And it could be, for example, for a 15-year-old kid on the bus, when they get on the bus leaving school to go to the track venue. And it could be the bus ride home and putting it in a notepad and putting that notepad in their backpack as they go to get off the bus and enter their house. So there's ways that you could compartmentalize these things so it's not something they're carrying with them, especially if they're thinking about things they need to correct and deficiencies. So it's things they're not carrying with them like baggage.
Um, so leading into our next question. So we've talked about, what is self-regulated sport practice, those different psychological process, what it looks like, where we can locate it within a practice. But now we want to get into ideas from you, the group tonight, about how can we act on this to help improve an athlete's competencies to utilize these self-regulated sport practice skills.
All right, so the floor is open again for more feedback. I mean, for me, off the top of my head, just again, being kind of deliberate about and communicating what the goals are, like even the goals of a practice, because then the athlete can kind of fit in their sort of what they have in mind of like, this is what I need to work on, and the coach is kind of coming with like, well, this is what we're working on today, and making sure you're working together on that so those things align, and that the coach can obviously give feedback to the athlete on like, well, you should be working on this, but also take feedback from the athlete where the athlete's like, I can't, I feel like I need this, and that the coach should be able to say, yeah, okay, you want to work on that, let's work on that. Yeah, so like as Larry says, lots of conversation, dialogue during practice. Like, how did that feel? Yeah, open conversation, says Yolande.
Yeah. Yeah. So tying into what Brad was talking about earlier with that interface
Hmm.
of that coach-athlete dialogue and communication.
Hmm. Another good comment from Fraser. So formal resources for this are becoming more available. This workshop. Volleyball Canada has a person pillar workbook. I've not heard of that, but I'll definitely check it out. Um, so yeah, so the coach can, kind of inform themselves on it in those ways, being aware of it. Yeah. Any other
We
ones?
can share some stuff at the end in terms of how we've been trying to work on it. I don't,
Hmm.
that's really interesting about the Volleyball Canada stuff. Um, yeah, we'll share some stuff at the end.
Yeah. Whiteboard with the workout at the beginning of practice, so all the athletes can take charge of their routine.
Yeah, that's a big one, knowing what the workout is going to be, so then they can actually think about how they're going to implement that.
Mhm. Okay. All right, go ahead.
Yeah. So again, if more pop up, feel free to
Yeah.
jump in.
Oh, sorry. Here's a couple
Oh,
more that just happened right here. So yeah,
okay.
appointing a team captain is or captains. And then yeah, and then again, Sam says, yeah, you have to explain it initially because some don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Nice.
So in our work that we've done with coaches, one of the things that has been most shared with us is that these self-regulated sport practice skills are going to become an expectation at a higher level, right? When we get into collegiate athletes or beyond, they're going to be expected to be able to do these types of things. So when we're considering where can we maybe start with some of our inexperienced athletes to get them to a point where they can be self-regulated? And as we've kind of, as some of the messages have kind of come through, well, one of the things we can do is we can be clear about the goals and the instructions for practice. And we can teach the athletes skills for how to self-correct by providing clear feedback. So with these first 2 points, it's really getting at this idea about, well, if you have an athlete that's truly inexperienced to the sport, it might be enough just to teach them what the sport entails and what practice involves and what good technique looks like and feels like. And so that way they can get an idea about how to start to do these things. Once an athlete has this kind of prerequisite information, well, as I think one of the suggestions was, well, we can start to use questions to prompt, planning, checking, or reflecting. So asking athletes what they want to think about in the next rep, or what they want to work on, or how did that go, or different questions like that to get them thinking about these types of processes and getting them involved in their training. You can seek athlete input about what they want to work on. So what do they want to do that day? But then going a step further and, okay, why do you want to work on that type of thing? And then the last one that we can maybe do here with some of our more developmental athletes is we can start to use journaling to prompt the reflection, or using athlete logs to get athletes to get beyond more than just this was the workout, but thinking about how that workout went.
And one really interesting thing about reflection, and so we see this when we talk to sports psychologists that are working with kind of adolescent clients, for example, around reflection on their practice activities, is they don't put enough self in the self-reflection. And so they're very good, for example, at telling you what happened. It was 4 sets of this on this, right? They're very good at telling you what happened. And they're actually pretty good at telling you about a product. So for example, I learned a new technique, or, I had this new achievement. What they're not good at is interpolating the self in that. So with what you told me happened, what were you doing while that happened, right? What was your role in that? And so when they tell you what they learned, like technique or some achievement, are they able to tell you what the self is in that? So what was your role in that coming about? What were your actions in that coming about? What were your decisions or strategies that you tried out for that to come about? And so really putting an accent when they do reflection on inserting the self in self-reflection.
So once an athlete has kind of developed some of these prerequisite skills or got the prerequisite information for how to go about regulating a good practice, we've started working on these learning to learn skills. Well, the next things that we can do as coaches is we can start to create practice challenges that's going to prompt athletes to have to use these skills. So for example, if you consider just getting athletes to switch between tasks within a practice, so maybe it's, again, falling on my distance running examples, but maybe you're getting an athlete to do a workout that's a blend of 5K pace and 1500 meter pace stuff, and they're having to switch between these rhythms and think about that adjustment and to reflect on it and plan how they're going to cue it with going into those ones. Or we were interviewing a sprint hurdles coach, and they were talking about how they would use different constraints or different implements. So having an athlete run with their arm in the air, or using different bands or different things like that to get athletes to feel certain things. And then when they would note how they felt, or that felt this way, and then they would then start to prompt them with, okay, why did it feel that way? Why? And they start questioning and getting them to think about the feeling and the kinesthetic awareness behind it. We can do different things to create time and space for athlete-led practice opportunities. And now this isn't to say that you need to just let athletes show up to a practice and decide the entire practice in its entirety. But you can give them choice over certain reps or drills within that workout, certain parts of that workout. You can have a menu of options. So they can start with these drills, but they can also do these ones, and they can pick and choose where they want to take that workout. And then you can also make them responsible for organizing and initiating aspects of that practice. So maybe making them responsible about they have to get their warm-up done on their own and be ready to go at this certain time. And then when you're doing that, you can also start to prompt some questions about why they're making the decisions that they're making. And then the last one is that we... Oh,
Royden, can I just jump in there with a comment?
yep.
So some of you have been around autonomy supportive coaching before. There's probably some people on the call that have heard that. You're going to hear a bit of that here. Like, it's in the same vein. And so when Royden talks about promoting self-regulated sport practice by giving choice, by letting athletes choose, a lot of that you'll hear if you talk to people that are motivational psychologists who talked about autonomy supportive coaching. I think what's different here is, yes, you give autonomy, but we're talking about attending and equipping your athletes with the self-regulatory skills to step into that space, into that autonomous space you're giving them. So it's one thing to give choice, but then you should be prepared at some other point later to attend to what they're telling you in terms of why they took that choice, and working them with discussion to shape that logic in a way that benefits them. You can give them, for example, a menu, or you can let them choose the sequence how they do things. That's fine. But at some point, you're going to have a conversation with them and hear their logic and explanation for why they chose to do that. And that becomes the substrates and the fodder that you could use to work with the athlete in a co-regulated discussion to make them better at their training. So I just want to interject that, because it is autonomy support, but it's on autonomy support plus. Because the skills, you can give kids autonomy or young athletes autonomy, but if they can't step in with the skills to use it, you risk actually losing structure in your practice.
And then so the last part here is that there's going to be naturally occurring moments in which an athlete has opportunities to make their own decisions or to take ownership over that training. So maybe it's before practice, they have time to do some physio work, or during practice, you might be busy as a coach, you might be busy with different athletes. So that athlete has moments in which they can decide and to do things on their own. So we interviewed a throws coach one time who talked about how there wasn't a lot of time for athletes to do anything before practice, but after a practice is done, some of the coaches would stay around, and the equipment shed was open. So those athletes could go into that equipment shed and to get the different implements that they would want to then practice with on their own. And so for that coach, it was about creating expectations that when they have opportunities to do that, they're doing that, and to encourage them and tell them that like they have permission to do these types of things. So the last thing, in addition to these different skills that we can, or different strategies that we can try and do to improve an athlete's use of these processes, within our lab, we're currently running a study right now, and which is looking at how do coaches view and understand and value a tool that's going to measure an athlete's use of these self-regulated sport practice processes. And more specifically, how would a coach consider actually using this tool to interact with their athletes to help in that athlete's development? So we're recruiting coaches who are working with U18 athletes primarily right now. And so the way this works is that we get the coaches to send out this SRSP survey. So this survey is 31 questions, and it measures the athlete's use of those processes across those, those 5 processes of planning, checking, evaluating and reflecting, self-efficacy for challenge, and effort. And so once you send it to your athletes, if we get about 10 responses back from those athletes, we'll collate it and we'll anonymize it. And then present it to you as the coach, and we'll have a conversation about, what do these scores mean to you? What do you think about these? First of all, what do you think about these processes? Is planning something that's important? And then what do your scores look like? Do you think that there's certain things that contribute to the score being something that you're happy about? Or if you're unhappy about it, okay, what do you think you could do to help act on this? So if you're interested in the study, if you're a U18, if you coach U18 athletes, and you'd like to maybe get involved in thinking about how you can go about this, please feel free to reach out to myself. Or if you have any questions about anything that we presented on or talked about today, feel free to reach out to either Brad or myself, and we're more than happy to talk about these self-regulated sport practice concepts. But I'd just like to take a moment to thank John and Kyle as well for giving Brad and I the opportunity to come here tonight to talk with you about some of our research and different ways about supporting greater athlete ownership in their training.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I encourage everyone to connect with Brad and Royden, because I can put my video back on here, and talk about this survey. So if you have any further questions, please put them in. I have a couple questions to kind of keep the conversation going a little bit here. But first, I don't know if everyone can see this or not,
Hey,
but
John, I also can make a couple of comments on some of the things that were in the inbox that were really particularly intriguing to me that we
yeah.
haven't really touched upon too.
Sure, yeah. So just I don't know if everyone can see it or not, but Sahid found the volleyball thing. So he put a link there. I don't know if everyone can see it. If not, we'll send it out
Thank you.
with
Thank you
everyone
for sharing
after
that.
anyway. But yeah. Okay, so Brad, well, why don't you start, Brad, with your
Yeah, just a
commentary
couple of
there?
things, and Roy can jump in if you want to add. It was a really interesting comment that went in a couple comments early on when people were reflecting on what is self-regulated sport practice. And so for sure it's ownership, right? The question of efficiency is an interesting one. I'm not convinced it's an absolute answer that it makes practice more efficient. There's a big difference between efficient learning and effective learning. And I think for sure, if you get your athletes to engage in self-regulated sport practice, the learning will be more effective. Why? Because they own that learning, they cognitively process it because it's more meaningful to them. They can tie it to their own kind of reflexivity. There's all kinds of psychological reasons why that's more effective practice. And we know that when people engage in skill development, particularly technical skill development, engaging some of those processes is going to encode some of those skills a little bit more deeply. I wonder, however, if I'm a coach making an initial foray into self-regulated sport practice, it's initially going to be a little bit more inefficient than you're used to in practice, because you initially need to create some time and space for it. You need to find athletes who are starting to use it that you can reinforce and use as models for others. And I think so. I think there could be an initial stage of inefficiency. So Royden, I don't know if you want to speak to that. We did some really interesting work with the hockey coaches. It was fantastic stuff where some of them came in, met with Royden, worked on this, and came back 2 weeks later. And they did speak a little bit about the initial inefficiencies and awkwardness, both for them as coaches and for the parents watching in the stands, right? Royden, can you speak to that a little
Yeah.
bit? But then they got over that.
Well, like sometimes for them, it was about taking a step back and just letting athletes make mistakes and to try and figure out how they were going to solve their mistakes, or giving opportunities for them to, hockey practices, from what they explained to me, was very controlled, and this was how it was going to be. And a lot of their concerns was, well, I only have an hour of ice time, and if we're not maximizing that ice time, then like what are we doing? So they were a little hesitant at first to give up opportunities to let athletes maybe pick the drill and to do what they want, or have some individuality within the practice. But what they found was they actually really liked when athletes were taking the ownership. They were taking those risks, making mistakes, but then thinking about it and correcting their own errors and really getting involved in their own training.
And the parents didn't like it initially because hockey parents are on the glass, and what they saw was, why are people standing around initially, right? It's funny, one of the coaches in the hockey liked it so much that he came back and he basically, I think he called it work what you want to work on window. And he provided a window when early on in the practice, when the kids came on the ice to work on what they wanted to work on. And at Royden, you remember, so the kids would come and they grab a puck. And so the kids go and do the Michigans. Everybody knows that crazy move where they go behind the net.
Yeah.
And so it's a super sexy thing to work on, right? But it was interesting because the coach waited for them to do it, and they came back, and the coach said to them, "Well, you're great doing that. You're improving. How often do you use that in a game?" So now the wheels are spinning, right? So you just invested in a 10-minute work on what you want to work on window, but is that the priority of what you work on? So the story went that kid then got in a discussion with the coach and ended up working on. They would throw the puck around the boards and he would, I forget what they called it, but he would pick it up on the backhand side. And so he changed from working on Michigans, which admittedly were fun, but he was only using them once a year in games, that skill, to work on skills that he was using every time he was on the backhand side in a power play. So the message there went by putting in a very short kind of work what you want to work on window and letting the athletes come on the ice and try that. The coach could survey and then start an open-ended conversation to learn about how the athlete was prioritizing and how they were regulating themselves. And that was pretty cool. So what is that metaphor for what we do in track and field, right? And then the last comment was an interesting one, was the team captain comment. I think it's a marvelous idea. I think what I hear, though, is we want to find, so in promoting self-regulated sport practice, we want to find an athlete who's modeling the engagement on these skills that would be a learning exposure for the other athletes. So I'm not sure calling it the team captain is the way to do it. I think it's finding some kind of nomenclature in your practice. Like if I was working with 16 or 17-year-olds, that when somebody has a really poignant self-regulatory moment, you call on that person as a resource. So in that situation, I probably wouldn't call them a team captain. I'd come up with some other funky name because they're a resource that everybody can hear from. But I think saying a team captain has a weight of kind of that person will direct others. And I don't think that's what we're doing there. We're looking to someone else who's providing an instance or a resource of a self-regulated sport practice instance and asking them to share.
Yeah, and I think this is all very individual, so it's kind of hard to have like you think
That's
of the
right.
captain as being like the one who rallies the athletes together, rallies the team, kind of separate from the coach, which is I think an important role. But each athlete is not necessarily being rallied to the same thing at the same
Correct.
moment, so it's not that. Yeah, I agree. It's not that's not
The
the
mechanics they
yeah
are.
yeah
The mechanics of planning, checking, evaluating,
yeah.
reflecting, they are. And so that's
Yeah.
the instance we want them to share. Whether the exact
Mhm.
details of what they're sharing is something that the other young athlete will use or not is up to them, right?
Yeah, it's your self-regulating sport practice champion. That's the
I like that.
he is
Champion,
the
or
champion.
yep, that's good.
I'd also just want to add in there about thinking about maybe which processes you're trying to develop. So we had a hockey coach in our interview one time talking about how when he was thinking about developing self-efficacy for challenge within his athletes, he was talking about one of the things that pretty common within his practices was that he'd always encourage athletes, hey, if you don't know what you're going to be doing in this drill, just go to the back of the line. Go to the back of the line, you'll figure it out, and then when you're comfortable, go in. And he started going, well, am I now taking away from those athletes to want to take risks, to want to put themselves out there and to want to take those risks and to try and challenge themselves? And so he really spent the interview thinking about, well, instead of getting these athletes to the back of the line, what can I do to try and encourage those athletes to go to the front of the line and to want to be the first one to take this challenge on? And so you'd almost want to be a little bit cautious if you had this team captain or someone that those athletes weren't just going to defer to them to figure it out, but that they're still going to want to take on some ownership, take some risks for themselves, and that you create a culture as a coach in which those risk-taking things are encouraged.
Mm. Um, do you have more comments, Brad? Because I had a couple questions for you guys if you wanted to. Yeah. So one thing you mentioned a few things like 16, U18, whatever. Is there an age when this should start? And is there perhaps like, introductory baby version for younger kids? And again, what age chronological sport age are we looking at here? Because you can get a 16-year-old who's like brand new and like needs a whole bunch of foundation first before they get into this versus you have, maybe a kid who's like 14 but's been doing the sport and they actually think about it. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. Royden, you want to crack? You want me? So, I mean,
Yeah,
maybe I'll go first, and then Royden, you can speak
this
about
is
what you
this is a
saw in the
Brad
interviews.
question.
Well, I mean, it's a great question, right? And so my answer is it's probably not suitable yet. It's progressive, right? We've been working mostly. So the reality is we were working a lot of this with our next gen and our National Training Institute athletes,
Mhm.
but a lot of those athletes are in such controlled training conditions that the scope of which in which they self-manage their practice can be limited. And so there's a lot more scope of self-management actually in adolescence. So we're trying to figure that out between the ages of 13 and 18.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's the best answer. It's progressive. You need to know your athlete well. There is a knowledge base that comes with this, right? So if somebody is a newbie to your event group, whether they're 13 or 17, there's going to be a knowledge impediment and a nomenclature that's not going to be there yet. You need to develop those communication and their knowledge about the skills and the tasks they have to do. Once that's down, then you can engage in self-regulated sport practice around that. So in terms of specifics on what we would roll out first and what we do second and do third, this is something we're figuring out as we develop the curriculum now.
Mhm.
Um, I think the last thing to come, which we haven't really talked about today, which we've learned from the sports psychologists that have talked to us about this, is the emotional regulation comes last. And
Mhm.
that's what Royden's doing with his PhD right now, figuring that out. So it's not a perfect answer. My best answer, it's progressive. And maybe you start where you think your athletes are.
Right.
I'd add on to that, start where you think your athletes are, but then also maybe it's a little bit of a consideration about what's going to be expected at them at the next level that they go to.
Mhm.
So we had a speed skating coach who talked about, she primarily worked with U14 athletes, but she talked about like, well, and after that, the way they were geographically located, it was into a much, after she was done coaching them, it was into a much more high performance environment. And so she knew the way that those coaches designed their practices, and those coaches would demand that those athletes already had the skill. So for her, it was really important at U14 that they really start the development of these skills, because in that situation, that sporting context, that was going to become the demand and the requirement.
Yeah. So to Royden's point, one of the specific curriculum features that our sports psych consultants use when they do self-regulated sport practice is that they take the scores for the self-efficacy for challenge scale, which is, what the athlete believes in terms of their ability to remain resilient and to be resourceful when they face kind of plateaus and real frustrations during practice. We take the scores in those four items and then we present the scores to the athlete.
Mhm.
The athlete reflects on their current scores, and then we challenge the scores by saying, okay, what do you think an athlete who's at the level above you right now, how would they score on this? And what would that look like in terms of their approaches and behaviors in practice? And so that we challenge and we get them to project. And so they would explain what they think that is, and with some support from either the sports psych consultant or the coach, there's a bit of
Mhm.
discussion that goes around. And so if there's a bit of a disjuncture there, then the younger athlete can then inflect on, well, are there any things I can fill that gap to get myself to the next level in terms of this particular psychological skill. So, like Royden said, getting someone to, in a respectful way, challenge their scores and get them to engage in a narrative about what this would look like to the next level is a place where you can take kind of this interaction with your athlete.
Nice. So that actually leads to my next question because you talk about the self-efficacy for challenge, and I know what you mean, but I don't think we actually in this hour presented the different categories of the survey. So would you take some time to kind of explain those categories and what they mean for the coaches, please?
Royden, you want to grab that?
Sure. So yeah, as I maybe I'll bring back up the slide
Yep.
just to help present them so they're a little bit more clear. Um, and so if we're looking at these five processes here, so there's planning. So this is this kind of gets at whether an athlete's goal setting, how they're analyzing a task, and ultimately planning before they go and do that task. Checking, which is, are they looking back on parts of that task to see if it was done well or done correctly? Evaluating and reflecting, that's, are those athletes then reflecting on that task to figure out what they want to do in the next one, or they're figuring out their strengths and their weaknesses and those kind of aspects of it. But then when we get into those more motivational processes, so self-efficacy for challenge, these questions, and so the questions on the survey are really getting at, does that athlete believe that they have the capability to perform well, even if a task is really, really difficult or really challenging? And so it's getting at their ability to cope with those challenges, and how adaptive they are and how resourceful and the different things that they can recruit to meet those challenges. And then effort is really getting at, do they think that, and have questions around, can they recruit effort and then ultimately concentrate throughout those difficult practice tasks?
Cool. Okay. So I think what I missed was the connection of this to the actual survey.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Well,
because that's
that's,
so the survey is questions that are asking the athletes about these five different
these,
elements.
yeah, so there's 31 questions. Those questions get broken down. Some go three, like three of them go into checking, or however many questions,
Hmm.
but they get broken down into these different categories that that you can then take, and look at those questions that they're answering and figure out, okay, what does that actually mean for how they're maybe planning going into this, or their personal beliefs around effort or something like that.
and you use the
Okay.
survey, you could sit down with the athlete
Hmm.
to actually discuss with them to make meaning, to
Hmm.
understand their meaning of those scores and what that means for their training, right? And so then you have some really rich information to be able to personalize and individualize how you interact with your athlete. And
Is
you can
there,
support them in developing places they need to go to get better at those things.
yeah, is there any, I don't want to say concern, but like, I feel like an athlete could take this list as a like, okay, like I want to get better at all these things, which is kind of good, but at the same time, like, I don't know if it's less organic or something that way. Like, I don't know, like in track and field specifically, we get a lot of like data oriented athletes. And so do you think it matters if they are like trying to win the survey, or is that just they're gonna end up in the right place if they do that?
So, couple things. The survey, when we did validate it as an assessment tool, is immune to self-presentation bias. So the Elite Advantage holds up even after you control for self-presentation and the people giving you scores they think they want to give you. The second thing is we rarely get ceiling effects in terms of the scores. If we get them anywhere, it's on one scale, which is I give effort, which is
Mhm.
fine because if you hit
Yeah.
a ceiling 7 out of 7 on all the items in effort, the discussion becomes a different one, which
Yeah.
is, do you think you have to give full effort on every task you do in training? Which is
Mhm.
also an interesting conversation when you take
Mhm.
somebody off the ceiling, because as you know, in training, we
Mhm.
periodize a lot of things and we also prioritize it within any one workout. And
Yeah.
so there's very few workouts where everything is 100%. So there are, so again, the meaning making uses the scores. So where we're moving it from is from less as an assessment tool and more as a narrative tool that coaches can use to talk to athletes, enrich the discussion with coach and athlete, because we think there's more value there. We'd rather have this tool used to support assessment as learning rather than as assessment to discriminate between athletes for picking a team. And so we've gone to that assessment as learning. What are we learning? What meaning making are we making by having an exercise where people engage in the survey and the athlete and coach talk about it? Right.
Mhm.
But it's a supplement to what Royden talked about today. Royden talked about promoting SRSP with times and spaces and shaping and modeling and communication during practice. The survey is but one. Yes, it's an important resource, we think, but it's a supplement to that.
Mhm. So I don't know, maybe this is a this is a quick no, but I was thinking about this and I was thinking about maybe a way of kind of, getting the athletes to kind of have a regular touch point with it is like some kind of, app where there's maybe not 31 questions, but like 3 to 5 kind of prompting questions, kind of daily, like, and I don't know how you would, maybe necessarily hit all five of the groups, but like just to kind of like as a way of getting the athletes into kind of a regular habit, or, as a almost like as a journal prompt as well. I don't know. I don't know if you thought about that.
If we're going there, there is a validated short form version with 10 items. So it is valid. And it's been used with a lot of track and field athletes right now in Poland, actually. So we'll see where that takes us in terms of narratives, but it's a lot shorter. It's more manageable. You can give it out more expediently, and you can get to the discussion a little bit quicker. The app's a great idea. Go ahead and get on that.
Yeah, I've wanted to do that for a while, but when talking with some of the coaches, they talked about how they would almost want to, if they were trying to develop these skills in athletes, maybe picking and choosing, okay, we're going to really work early season on developing their skills of planning. And so I would love to just take these specific planning questions, forget the rest of the survey for now, but just use them in conversation, and really move it to that narrative piece around, let's just do these parts for now. And then later in the season, maybe self-efficacy for challenge becomes more important.
So you're periodizing the self-regulated sport practice, which is fantastic. Yeah.
And the one thing we learned from the Nordic Canada workshop, where we actually got people to go through the survey and start thinking about each of the scales that had to do with the different psychological process, depending on the coach, some coaches valued some processes like planning, whereas other coaches actually, it was all about the eval and reflection for them. And others, it was about the self-efficacy for challenges. And so they kind of had favorites. And so they would actually think about addressing those, and they would prioritize. So now Royden's idea about working that back to periodization is great. I think very simply thinking about periodization, a good time to bring this in is pre-comp, right? You want to set this as kind of as part of your fundamental table if you think this is something you want to work on with your athletes, right? And if there's going to be some inefficiencies when first bringing it in, I think you want to get it out of the way in the pre-comp.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So we're a bit over an hour here, which is usually how it goes. But we do want to be respectful of everyone's time, and an hour is usually about the attention span that people have on a weeknight. So thank you so much for coming and doing this. Really excited to see how this has progressed too, and I look forward to reading the results of Royden's research with all the track coaches and everything too. So. Yeah, thanks so much. And we will be sending out the slides. People always ask this, and also I'll get the link from Sahid to the volleyball thing to share with people in case they want to check out that resource. Yeah, and hopefully this is something the coaches can start to try to do and work with the athletes. So thank you.
Thank you for the engagement from your coaches as well. It's not easy in this format, and I wrote down a ton of comments, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.